Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining and welcome to the OpenAQ Global Community Series, Investing in the Air We Breathe, a conversation on the global air quality funding landscape. A couple of webinar logistics. We want to remind you that this webinar will be recorded and we'll provide it on the OpenAQ YouTube channel after the session. Please introduce yourself. I think many of you are tuning in from different parts of the world. We would love to hear your name, organization, and location in the chat box. And if you have any questions, please use the chat box. And just as a reminder, please make sure that you select the drop-down menu option to panelists or everyone. Just a brief community series overview. We're really excited to have such a wonderful group of panelists today. After a welcoming remarks from the OpenAQ team, we'll be hearing from Maguire at Clean Air Fund, followed by Priya Shankar at Bloomberg Philanthropies, Ankit Bhargava at Sensing Local, and Marcel Martin at Instituto Clima e Sociedade, followed by a panel discussion with selected Q&A from participants and closing remarks from OpenAQ. Now I'll turn it over to our Executive Director, Jeremy Tao.
Thanks so much, Sociedade. I want to introduce myself for those who don't know me. My name is Jeremy Tao. I'm the Executive Director of OpenAQ. And I want to start by thanking everyone for being here, our amazing panelists, everyone that's joined us, and Sociedade, who we'll hear from again in a moment, for all of her amazing work in bringing us together today. I want to say that this conversation about funding is an incredibly timely discussion for the work that we are certainly doing at OpenAQ, and one that I certainly think about in our role as a growing organization within the air quality ecosystem, but also with the perspective of someone who spent the first part of my career as a grant maker in a number of different places. So I just want to encourage all of you to engage with us throughout today, and we really want to hear from you and your questions, and then to continue the conversation after this. We see this as really just the beginning of that conversation. So many of you are familiar with our work, but I wanted to just very briefly share with you about OpenAQ and kind of what we're doing. So as you can see here, we're working to really address some of the challenges that we're finding in the air quality space, and specifically the types of gaps and that are in air quality data that create a number of challenges. And have shared them here, again, really focused on the lack of data that is being produced based on our previous global state of play, and we'll be updating that over the summer. Only half of the world's governments are producing air quality data. We're not having a lot of folks that are necessarily bringing on real-time data. And we're seeing a number of data that may be produced from some governments, but is not being shared in a fully open manner. And then the final point is just the unequal access to clean air for most burned. And I think that there's two pieces there. One of them is that there is over 1 billion people who don't have access to clean air data in their country, but then at the same time, and really the most important thing is that many of the people who are most burdened are bearing the greatest health and environmental impacts of clean air. So for us, we see as making air quality data fully open and transparent is truly fundamental to enabling society to achieve clean air. Next slide, please. So what we're doing to address this is that we have created the largest open source, open data platform for hosting air quality data. And we ingest and harmonize disparate air quality data sources and put it into a standardized format. And that's from a variety of sources, both real-time, historical, stationary, and mobile. And at this time, focused on outdoor ambient air quality data. And we've got 6 billion data points from 120 countries. And we take all that data and we make that available to anyone who wants access to that, both through an API and on our website. And at this time, we have on average about 35 million API requests a month. The use of our data is quite diverse. We've got researchers who are using the data that we host as part of academic and applied research, journalists such as Bloomberg Green, who integrate the air quality data into their data dash, activists, community members, and developers who all make up our community, along with governments and NGOs and philanthropists and community scientists. So we are really driven by the engagement with our community as both contributing to our platform and engaging with us in different ways and using the data that we host and the tools that we make available. We started by bringing on government reference grade air quality data, but given some of the challenges that we've seen around coverage and transparency and opportunities that we've had, we've also been adding more recently low-cost sensor air quality data sources to our platform, and we're looking to add more. So just a quick kind of note to say that please be in touch if you have access to any type of data, whether that's low-cost sensor or government data or some combination thereof, or research data. We'd love to hear from you. Very quickly, our mission is to provide open access to air quality data for all in order to inform, empower, coordinate, and convene effective action among diverse global stakeholders in the fight for clean air. When we think about it, we're looking to achieve clean air for all. We're looking to do this through a lens that thinks about these questions of coverage and transparency, which are really fundamental to our work. But I also want to take a minute to talk about the access piece, because that's really a lot of what we're going to be talking about in many ways today and as we go forward. The way that we think about kind of the access is that, and given the unequal access to clean air and these unequal burdens associated with air pollution, we're really looking to democratize that access to air quality information and data to really enable that action, that collective action. And so to do that, we're doing that in a number of different ways and reflecting community feedback. We're developing a number of tools and enhancements, such as a co-location tool and a versioning tool and others, as well as thinking about what type of community engagement we can do to extend the reach of the air quality data that we host, so that anyone can use this data to tell the story about air pollution and support solutions for driving toward clean air for all, and really to humanize that data. So in a second, I'm going to turn it over to Sociedade to talk about how we're thinking about that community engagement. But again, I just want to thank everyone for being here and look forward to hearing from all of you and continuing the conversation with all of you, both throughout and after this workshop. Sociedade.
Thanks, Jeremy. So at OpenAQ, data is just one piece of the puzzle, and we recognize that. And we want to be able to be that bridge between air quality data and the communities that we're aiming to impact and support along their journey to fight for clean air. So 3 ways that we've been doing that. The first is the OpenAQ community workshops. We've organized these collaborative multi-stakeholder workshops where we bring together diverse stakeholders together from science, journalism, civil society, software engineering, and government to really collaboratively think about what are some of the challenges that communities are facing on the ground when it comes to air quality, and then also collectively brainstorming solutions. And so 2 examples I want to highlight is that in Accra, Ghana, the participants demanded a community statement demanding increased air quality data coverage and sensor donations. And we also just organized a workshop virtually in Los Angeles last week with the City of LA and NASA, where the community stakeholders really brainstormed how to apply air quality forecasting data to better improve the air quality, especially among communities of color who have historically and systemically been facing air pollution challenges in the greater Los Angeles area. We also launched our inaugural Community Ambassador Program in March, where we are supporting leaders in Kenya, South Africa, India, Albania, and Mongolia. And this is essentially a leadership program that is designed to amplify their work on the ground, particularly looking at the intersection of air quality data and community. And finally, of course, as you all joined today, this community webinar series is part of a broader community series at OpenAQ, which are virtual webinars to highlight pertinent air quality topics. And we've covered diverse topics from air quality sensors and its potential new tools to environmental justice around the globe. So the goals of this community series is twofold. First is to better understand the global landscape of air quality funding, particularly about the gaps, challenges, and opportunities, as well as to spark that initial conversation in philanthropic organizations that are tackling the air pollution challenge in both the global north and the global south. So thank you so much for listening to our overview. This is our team. And I'm very excited to hand it over to Sean Maguire at Clean Air Fund for the first presentation. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you, Chisato. It's great to be here. I'll dive right in. I've got a few slides and I'll try and rattle through them so I don't take up much more than my fair share of time. So I've titled the presentation State of Global Air Quality Funding because I thought that was a fairly apposite title for the whole conversation we're having, but also because it's the title of our flagship annual report on air quality funding. And that's what I want to talk about principally. But first of all, if we can go to the next slide, I want to tell you a little bit about who we are at the Clean Air Fund. So the Clean Air Fund is a global philanthropic initiative. We were founded in 2019. We're backed by a lot of the foundation funders you might have heard of, SIF, IKEA, Oak, Bernard Van Leer, and of course, Bloomberg as well. And we're particularly pleased that we have a diverse range of funders across climate, children, mobility, and health, because we think that's a real testament to how cross-sectoral the air quality issue is. So we work basically across 4 pillars. We help create and share local data so that air pollution and its impacts are visible to all. We build pressure for clean air by increasing public demand and the political will to act. And we support governments and businesses to put the right laws, policies, and standards in place to clean the air. And we strengthen the clean air movement and we increase funding into clean air action. And how do we achieve impact? Well, we're a re-grantor. So we fund partners working to make clean air a reality at every level, and we amplify the movement's impact and we complement and collaborate. So that's basically what we do at the Clean Air Fund. So let's jump to the next slide and talk about the state of global air quality funding. This is our signature contribution to the air quality movement. But I think it's really important to state up front what this doesn't capture. I mean, there is money that goes into air quality work at the city level, at regional level, at government level, and this kind of report doesn't capture that. But what it can do is it can capture funding flows that tend to cross borders into other countries to fund air quality work. So in the first year, 2019, we tracked just philanthropic funding. The second year, which is what I'm featuring here, we broadened it to cover foundations and ODA granting. And this year, the report will cover philanthropy, ODA grants, and importantly, IFI lending. And I think the last one is a really important point, a significant point, because we know there is quite a lot of air quality lending by the international finance institutions. Especially for example, by the ADB to China. But nobody's really tracking it, and we want to understand if it's really good quality lending. And then obviously we can try to influence the quality and direction of that lending. So in this report, in the first 2 years, we took a deliberately narrow view of what constitutes air quality funding, because we really wanted to identify the money that was going directly to air quality issues, air pollution issues. So if a grant a grant would need to be made directly towards improving outdoor air quality to qualify for the database. So this year we'll examine the same, but we'll also look at the size of the pot of granting and funding where improvements to air quality are a secondary or indirect benefit. And obviously that's a much larger pot. So we're not sure yet exactly how good our analysis will be of that this year, but we'll make a start of that. Okay, so we can go to the next slide. So if you can click through to the messages, that would be great. There are 4 of them. So as you can see in 2020, the key messages that emerged were there is underfunding at an absolute level, that ODA funding is lagging behind foundation funding in trending upwards. Some of the funding is misdirected, and there are missed opportunities to secure co-benefits to the funding that is happening. So let's go into each of those one by one if we can go to the next slide. So if you can just click through so they all pop up. Thanks very much. So, you know, comparisons are odious, obviously, and the point is really about the lack of investment compared to the high health impact. And you can see here that outdoor PM2.5 pollution is categorized as the sixth leading risk factor for premature death. And then if you look at the graph on the right, or the table on the right, you can see that the amount of money going to that compared to disability adjusted life years lost is very, very small compared to what's going to malnutrition and HIV. And the point, of course, here is not to say don't give money to malnutrition or HIV, of course not. But I think it's about trying to draw attention to the health gains that you can get if you were to invest in air quality. Okay, so let's move to the next slide, please. And if you can just click to both graphs, thanks very much. So you can see there's a bit of an upward trend over the years from 2015 to 2019 in foundation funding. But again, let's remember this is all at a very low level. You can see that in 2019 it was $31.6 million. It's very, very small amounts of money overall. And the amounts in ODA giving are equally small, but very varied and very lumpy, as one large grant can skew the overall picture. So let's go to the next slide. The other thing that comes across in the 2020 report is that funding isn't necessarily going to where the problem is most significant. We'll see that a little bit more clearly in a second, but you can see that there hasn't really been any or not very much improvement in PM2.5 exposure in North Africa, the Middle East, and Sub-Saharan Africa. And you can see where those concentrations are particularly high. And if we go to the next slide, and we'll click through to both graphs, you can see that a lot of the ODA and foundation funding is going to the global north, as well as to India and China. And you'll see in the graph on the chart on the left, the amount going to Africa is absolutely tiny, infinitesimal. Now, you may argue, well, air pollution is the least of Africa's concerns, but in actual fact, there are parts of Africa where air pollution issues are very, very significant. And we know that Africa's population is growing in a way that it isn't growing in other parts of the world. And we know that urbanization is taking place very, very quickly in Africa. So air pollution is a big problem looming for Africa, and yet there's very little funding going into that. And yet again, on the official donor grant funding, you can see just how lumpy the numbers are, the data is, because the overall figures are so low. Okay, so next slide, please. If you can click through to the next graph. Thanks very much, Sato. Yeah, what's this saying? It's essentially saying that one of our key recommendations is to make more of the co-benefits from tackling air pollution. Most of the people on this call will not need convincing of that. We know that tackling air pollution is good for health, it's good for economic growth, it's good for jobs, it's good for children, it's good for cities, it contributes to multiple SDGs. But somehow or other, we don't think that message is getting across. And if that message was getting across, perhaps funding flows would be higher. Now, I've got a special treat for you because just in the last week, we have gotten the first cut of data for philanthropic funding for this year's report. So I'm just very quickly going to show you a few slides on that. So if we can go to the next slide. So this is the preliminary results for the 2021 report. And as I said earlier on, the 2021 report will come out on Blue Skies Day on September the 7th. So just in 2 or 3 months' time. And so please watch out for the social media activity around that and the webinars that we'll be doing around that. So this is an initial cut of the data for foundation funding. And you'll see that the orange bar is what we had for a particular year in last year's report, and the blue bar is what we have for that year in this year's report. So why are the blue bars bigger than the orange bars? It's because this year we've been able to go back again and look again at the data, the database, and have discovered more activity that has gone into clean air in those years. So the numbers are getting a bit more accurate, is what we're saying. You'll see in column 6, it's already as high as last year, and we know we still have some grants, some foundation funding to add to that. So we anticipate the overall level of funding to be up by about 15% in comparison to last year's number, which is a little bit of good news. So if we just go to the next slide, thanks. So one of the things we analyze is the categorization of grants, and we try to see whether there's any shift in emphasis from foundation grant makers to project type. And you can see that policy and politics and communications are still the most significant areas. And it's not really any surprise that implementation funding for philanthropy remains low, because implementation is what we tend to see funded by states and cities and by ODA grantors as well. But one of the things that we're beginning to see that is interesting, particularly for this group, of course, is that we're seeing more foundation funding beginning to flow towards data, data availability and data accessibility, which I think is interesting. So let's move on to another slide. And again, preliminary look. We like to try to understand the data by funder type. And we're seeing a little bit of a shift here, which is interesting. The proportion of grants by funders with social impacts and other interests, mobility, education, culture, etc., as part of their funder type has increased. So this is in the sort of other section, which you will see is the kind of yellow section, which has gone from 12 to 19%. So what that means is that the vast majority of granting still comes from the climate and environment funding foundation sector, but there are a few more organizations that classify themselves as social impact funders coming into this field. And we'll try and dig a bit more to understand what that means. And I think as part of our conversation around environmental justice, we try to understand whether there are some funders who look at the world through an environmental justice lens or through a social justice lens are beginning to see that air pollution is an issue that they should work on. So if we just switch to the final slide. I always like to finish with an image of who air pollution impacts most and why we should care about the amount of funding that goes into the issue. So there you are, children. Thanks very much. I hope that was useful.
Thank you so much, Sean. Really appreciate your presentation and providing such a global overview. I think it's really helpful context as we move into the next speakers. Next, I'm very pleased to introduce Priya Shankar at Bloomberg Philanthropies. Priya?
Thanks, Sociedade, and thanks, Sean, also for that really helpful overview of the global philanthropic funding landscape. I'm going to delve a little bit deeper into our own programs at Bloomberg Philanthropies. Next slide, please, Sociedade. So for those of you that don't know Bloomberg Philanthropies, our mission is focused on ensuring better and longer lives for the greatest number of people. And we have in programs that we support in 810 cities and 170 countries around the world. And you can see, kind of looking at that mission around better and longer lives for the greatest number of people, why we're so interested in air quality. I think it also marries two of the really strong interests of our founder, Mike Bloomberg, which are climate change and public health. And air quality is an issue that links them quite closely together and has benefits in both. Next slide, please, Sociedade. Now, I think most of you here will know this and be familiar with this, but I think it's worth highlighting that air pollution is a global challenge, with 90% of the world's population breathing air that's considered unhealthy by the WHO. And it's a big public health challenge as well. I know Sean had a slightly different number there focused on ambient air pollution, but if we look at air pollution overall, it's one of the leading causes of premature deaths in the world. And we also know that air pollution isn't only an environmental or public health challenge, but also an economic one, which, according to estimates by the World Bank, costs the world $5.7 trillion, or nearly 5% of global GDP. Next slide, please. Now, our air quality program at Bloomberg Philanthropies really works with local partners to improve air quality management with stronger data and better policies. And our work is structured around 4 different pillars. The first around communications and public health awareness. The second around stronger evidence and data, working with partners such as OpenAQ. The third around policy engagement and advocacy. And the fourth around peer-to-peer learning and capacity building. And we have strong programs in particular in 3 geographies that I'm going to talk about: in India, Western Europe, and Southeast Asia. Next slide, please. Now, in India, we have a partnership with the Indian government on the country's national clean air program to provide technical assistance. And this is really focused on understanding sources of air pollution through source apportionment studies, emissions inventories, and also looking at sort of cost-benefit analyses. And we're also working with a number of cities to develop clean air action plans. And we're encouraging capacity building and peer-to-peer learning among these cities, and also through exchanges with cities in other parts of the world. And we've adopted a sort of multi-level approach, which we think is very important in terms of tackling air pollution, where we're engaging at the sort of national, state, and city level in a number of different cities in India. And additionally, we have a thing with the Maharashtra State Pollution Control Board and local partners. Next slide, please. In Western Europe, our approach is very much on piloting small sensors and seeing how these new innovative technologies can be applied and complement the existing strong, robust monitoring systems that exist in these geographies. We've had a pilot in Paris where 150 small sensors were deployed around schools in partnership with the city there. In London, we're building on the great work that the Clean Air Fund did for the next phase of Breathe London to strengthen air quality monitoring in the city with a strong focus on community engagement. And in Brussels, we're supporting innovation, research, citizen engagement, and education programs. Next slide, please. In Southeast Asia, we have a partnership with the government of Jakarta, which is focused on understanding sources of pollution and communicating them, including through a dedicated website that we've worked with partners in the Jakarta government to help set up. And we're also supporting capacity building work in the wider region in countries such as the Philippines and Vietnam. Next slide, please. Now, I think one of the kind of lessons that we always draw on for our air quality work, and something that's informed it, is the experience that Mike Bloomberg had as mayor of New York City when he formed Plan NYC for a greater and greener New York. And one of the key aims in this plan was to improve air quality in the city. And one of the things that led to that was the identification through innovative monitoring methods of heating in buildings being a major contributor to pollution in the city, which led the city to then launch the NYC Clean Heat Initiative, which focused on phasing out the dirtiest fuels and boilers in buildings and promoting cleaner technologies. And as a result of that and a number of other measures, New York in over 6 years had the cleanest air that it had had in 50 years. It reduced SOx by 70% and particulate matter by over 20%, and the life expectancy of New Yorkers increased by 3 years in this period. Next slide, please. Drawing on the New York City experience and also the work that we've been doing in other parts of the world, and a guide that our partners Vital Strategies prepared, looking at case studies from 8 cities around what drives change and progress and improvement in air quality. We find that there's really 4 key things that help drive progress and change. The first is better evidence and data, and that's why the work that OpenAQ does to provide open access data to populations and communities all over the world is so important, because that's the first step, is sort of really understanding the levels of air pollution. The second is policy and political leadership, where we've seen that strong policy leadership, as we witnessed in New York, but we've also seen in other places such as London and Mexico City, has really helped drive change. The third is public awareness and public demand. I think there's not likely to be, even though we might have the kind of other ingredients, but if there isn't strong public awareness and public demand for cleaner air, it doesn't often lead to change. And we've seen the role that public awareness can play in help driving change on air pollution in China and other places. And the fourth is partnerships. I think air quality is an issue that integrates so many other issues and so many different causes that we really need multi-level and multi-stakeholder action to address it. It's a city government acting alone wouldn't be able to address air quality. It will need kind of cooperation from business and citizens and national and regional governments. So I think that level of kind of partnership and multi-stakeholder and multi-level action is also key in addressing air pollution. Next slide, please. And finally, we'd like to thank all our partners who work with us on this work, including OpenAQ, the Clean Air Fund, the India Climate Collaborative, who are all here on this panel today. We feel we've made some progress over the last couple of years, but there's a lot more to be done, and really look forward to working with all of you here to help address and take this further. Thank you.
Thank you, Priya, for your wonderful presentation. It's very inspiring to learn about all the different countries in which there's project implementation taking place, and the 4 ingredients for change, and the multi-level and multi-stakeholder approach that's so necessary in this air quality work. So thank you very much for sharing. Next, I'm pleased to introduce Ankit Bhargava at Sensing Local. Ankit?
Hi, everyone. Very glad to be here. Thank you, Chisato. Thank you to OpenAQ. I'm here to India Climate Collaborative and AT&T Foundation, where we are looking at mapping India's ecosystem working on air quality. If you could go to the next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. And the project is that, as Priya already mentioned, it is a multi-sectoral and multi-stakeholder issue. And so we are looking at sort of mapping this ecosystem from this lens. And I think this perspective, even though it's very obvious, it on the ground, the perception is not as a multi-sector and multi-stakeholder. It is still limited to researchers, also campaigners. And so it has been an effort to assimilate all of this diversity that we can find around stakeholders and try to look at the tag them as equality actors and bring them into the fold. So this program is called the India Clean Air Connect, and as I mentioned, so it is there to map the diverse India to help unlock barriers to air quality action at scale. And the key goal that ICC set for this is to support greater collaboration, coordination, alignment. Next. Yeah. Okay. This particular project has actually come out of previous convenings the India Climate Collaborative had done in 2019 and 2020, where a lot of the actors who are working on air quality sort of met. And one of the big things that came out of it was that we still don't know who's working on air quality in India. We still don't know what kind of work is going on. And so this, I mean, it's a very fundamental question. And so this led to the particular project that we are doing right now, which is looking at ecosystem mapping. Next. Yeah. So as we venture into this program, there were two. So this program started in December, and there were two main questions that we had in front of us. One was that how can philanthropic funding be more strategically channelized in order to support the most urgent and impactful air quality work? And the second is that we know that philanthropic funding is not enough. We know that we need to depend on the larger ecosystem to start solving for this complex and huge problem. So what are the existing knowledge can be leveraged better? And I must say that the underlying issue here is also that India is a very large country, and there's a huge amount of asymmetry between where the expertise is, where the funding is going. And so this sort of issue of trying to assimilate the ecosystem and try to leverage it better is a massive issue in itself. Next. Yeah. So how are we doing this exercise? We are looking at this ecosystem mapping approach to go and listen to people on the ground and understand, okay, what are you doing? Where are you doing your work? What are your experiences? What are your challenges on ground, et cetera, and this is the ones that we find with regard to gaps in knowledge, collaborations, funding challenges, et cetera, by region, by types of organization, by expertise, et cetera. And we are also aggregating priorities of people. And what you see below in the slide is these three sort of divisions have been something that we've tried to hone all the time, is that ensuring that in the discipline, scientists, lawyers, journalists, campaigners, and trying to capture representativeness within that 100 cities overall. And of 300 cities, 124 are called non-attainment cities, which means there is a recognition that the air pollution is bad here, so the National Clean Air Program kind of addresses it. And there are 73 clusters that are termed as CETIs, so critically polluted industrial areas. So it's a very large landscape. So as we were doing this ecosystem mapping, we've also tried to ensure that we reach out to people who are working in all of these geographies across different sources of air pollution. So not just monitoring air quality, but also looking at people who are working in waste, people who are looking at industry emissions, indoor air pollution, transport, etc. Next. How do we see this exercise being? It is a short exercise. It was looked at as a 4-month exercise. It's more close to 6 months now. It is an emergent exercise. It's not an end, but actually we feel that it's a starting point of a much larger assimilation that's happening now. We imagine that with all of this data that we are collecting, actually we look at it as more like voices that we are collecting about who's working and what they're doing. We imagine that our ecosystem. Second is because, and I'll mention that later, that where you can find like-minded people. So it's also an exercise where you can find, okay, who can I partner with, who's working in one state or one city. It's also giving visibility to sources of knowledge, because that's something that we're capturing as well. As I mentioned earlier, there's a lot is also opening up the opportunities that are available, that are there both in terms of knowledge, expertise, and funding. And the last thing that I want to say is that we also look at this exercise as taking stock of the collective experience that we can map so far. So where are we standing as a whole? Next, please. Yeah. I wanted to place these two slides, this slide and the next, even though it may seem a little technical, but I did want to sort of just lay it out there that the goal of this exercise is trying to see that how do we go from, not necessarily the exercise, but perhaps the output of this exercise would be that how do we go from a landscape of diverse actors to a thriving ecosystem. So that's like the big question that has been on our mind. And we're trying to work towards mapping this so that we can actually help transform this. And the way we've looked at this exercise is to look at it in 3 dimensions, like what is an ecosystems, is trying to break it into entities, that is the organ, and now. At the same time, also looking at the value exchange between actors. So why are people collaborating? What is the engagement right now? What are the common goals, etc. And the third is the service environment around which the ecosystem exists and how it interacts, which is basically the policy environment, the roles and responsibilities of the stakeholders right now, as well as people would like them to be. Also the funding environment and the balance, like these 3 are the building blocks of this entire research project. Next. And I don't want to get into this slide, but basically for us, it's been an exercise of what you can see in the problem statements. It's really trying to understand that, okay, if you're trying to map actors, who are these different actors? How do we classify them? If you're trying to map relations, what are those kinds of relations that we should be looking at? What are the different kinds of ways in which people are engaging with each other? When we're looking at also like assessment of the ecosystem is also about capacities. So how do we measure capacities of individual actors and the ecosystem as a whole? And lastly, because one of the issues is that there is no clear consensus within the community, how do people then bring together shared goals in shared areas of work that we can imagine? Next. Next, please. Okay, I think in the last few slides here, I just wanted to put this up there because there's a global audience. That's India in the map, and you can see we've mapped the 124 cities and the 73 CEPI, that's critically polluted industrial clusters, and you can see how diverse and how widely spread they are. And this is the scale that we're dealing with. And I put on the left also the bigger metrics which constitute India, which is 7,000 towns, 28 states, 300 cities, etc. And 46 cities are over 1 million. And I think Priya and Sean have already talked about like what is the scale of the health crisis that we're dealing with here. Next. In the last 4 or 5 months, what we started with a list of around 150 actors, which was made by Dr. Pallavi Pant from HAI, and we started from there, and we mapped around 350 actors so far. In the map, you'll see that how well spaced they are. Like we've pretty much managed to cover all the states in India, and we found a whole bunch of people across the world that are also working in India. And when we started, we were like, yeah, sure, most of them will be in India, but we found so many people reaching out to us who were not in India. And so it's really interesting to see this global ecosystem that is operating in India. And we spent a huge amount of effort to reach out to these people, which sort of says its own things. Like we ran social media campaigns, we built a project website, sent personalized emails, direct phone calls, webinars, all of that. And that's also a lot of onboarding that had to be done while we were doing this project because of the way that these exercises are perceived and expectations around people with such exercises where you engage people and get data out. And then what? Okay, and, next please. This slide to secondary sources, and in some cases, we also asked them to fill a form. And so we got like we were always trying to reach it to true authentic data. And that has been the pursuit. In this exercise, we've done that, and we have done detailed interviews with people, which are the 87 people that we thought were key actors across India that if you understood their voice, would kind of give you a sense of India's ecosystem. And what you see below is the pie of the division of representation that we try to maintain. We kind of knew the organization types we wanted to kind of chase, but our effort was always to make sure that we have diversity across sectors of expertise, and we have diversity across organization types. Next. Okay, so this is just the last slide. So I just wanted to, we are in the middle, we are at the end of this project actually, not the middle, but and the report should be coming out soon. And ICC will be sharing the findings in the convening that they'll be holding as well for the larger air quality community. But for us, I think I just wanted to leave this last slide where I wanted to just mention that as we're doing this exercise, one of the big things that we've also come across is that if you're asking people an hour-long interview about some of these questions about their experiences, the challenges, etc., you will never get a sense of the entire ecosystem. What you get is what's most important to them. And so for us, this exercise has been like building a canvas where everyone has one piece of the puzzle, and trying to build all of these pieces together and trying to always like give each one their view and not try to up one or the other one as a smaller player, but be intelligent about it. The second thing has been that how do you cluster voices so that you can see trends? This is easier said than done, but for us, organizations, sector, regions, and various ways in which people engage has been one way of organizing their voices together and coming to the surface, like what we see is happening against different groups so that they can then act. And the last thing is that, as you can see, these are like small scales going from granular to the high level. The last thing is also at the end of all of these 87 long interviews, we also want to distill the most important things that are occurring across these 87 actors and hopefully be able to summarize at a high level the shared issues and the shared sort of needs that are high priority to action on. So yeah, as I mentioned, this will be converted into, we are hoping to convert this into a portal which is already in development, and it will go live where you can find all these 350 actors and people join this resource portal, which is the link that I have given called India connect.org. Anybody who's worked on, and we'll actually add them to the portal. And all these findings will soon be available there in the convening that we'll also hold. I think in a month or so, when ICC.
Great, thank you so much, Ankit, for providing such an important study. Thanks for asking that and interrogating that question of who is doing what in the ecosystem. I think that such a comprehensive approach to this research is really necessary, and we're looking forward to receiving the results and being able to understand and better analyze the broader ecosystem in India, and hopefully it can be a model for other countries as well in terms of your approach. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Our final speaker is Marcel Martin at Instituto Clima e Sociedade. Marcel?
Thank you, Shisato. Thank you, the OpenAQ team, for the opportunity. Next slide, please. So ICS is a regulatory institute. Our mission is to strengthen the conditions leveraged in enduring practice, climate change and mitigation and resilience. And our vision, it's a carbon neutral Brazil with economic growth and social justice compatible with 1.5 degrees. Next, please. We are a regulatory institution, and this is some of our grantors. Unfortunately, it's not super updated. Next, please. in 2019, we funding 89 projects, around 30 millions reais, 30 millions. The transport and air quality portfolio correspond around 50% of this amount. And then 2020 it's a little bit bigger than 2019. Next, please. We work with integrated focus on climate change, and our strategy work with 5 portfolios: climate and policy outreach, low carbon economy, energy, land use, and transport and air quality. I will talk specifically about transport and air quality. Next, please. Next, please. Transport and air quality portfolio. So what happened in Brazil? This is the profile of greenhouse emissions in Brazil. And you can see the agriculture and land use is the biggest emission source for emissions. And after that, the transport is relevant. And it's important because it's a little bit different around the other countries around the world, which electricity is one of the mainly source of emissions. In Brazil, our matrix, it's not pollutant, so we have a lot of hydraulic, solar, and wind sources. But it's important because this profile from greenhouse emissions can provide us a little bit the consequence of air pollutions. So transport in the big cities of Brazil is the most responsible for air pollution in Brazil. But if we look of the Amazon cities in the north of the country, agriculture and land use is the mainly problems, especially because of the burns in Amazonia. So we have this different profile of greenhouse emissions, and in consequence of that, the impact of air pollution. Next, please. And how we can deal, how we work with that? Reinforce link among vehicular emissions, air pollution, health impacts, and sorry, I need to add here, the burns in Amazon, which in the last year is huge. So we work to develop a technical basis, advocacy to strengthen air quality policies, public campaigns, and litigations. I will example a few slides about the work which our grantees did in the last year. Next slide, please. So when we talk about development basis, this is one of the works of IEMA. IEMA is a local institution which work with air quality and mobility and energy in Brazil. This is the network in Brazil. In fact, what we can see, and this is very important, we can see a concentration of network in São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, and Espírito Santo states, and a little bit in the north, Salvador, Brasilia, and in the south in Porto Alegre. But what is important in this map, we didn't see a network in the north of the country and the middle of the country. So in fact, we don't know exactly which is the conditions of air quality in Brazil because we have a huge lack of network to measure the pollutants. If you can see in the right, we saw the pollutants which measures, and this is the government resources. It's the official network. Unfortunately, most part of that don't measure PM 2.5, but in São Paulo we have a better network. But as I said, in the main part of the country, we don't have this network. Next, please. Other initiatives which we funding is about other institutions, Health and Sustainable Institute. They work in technical support with public minister to adopt in Brazil the WHO parameters because our parameters are below when we compare with WHO, and create some reports and technical basis to guarantee and provide technical sources for advocacy. Here is an example to adopt the Euro 6 standard, because in Brazil, we have the last year, the automobile industry tried to delay the adoption of Euro 6 because of the COVID impacts, and they work to provide the impacts in health to not delay this adoption, because the impact in health, in public health, is huge. Next, please. And this is an example of public engagement. This is a campaign, The Invisible Enemy. It's exactly about the Euro 6 standard. This work was run by a Coalizão Respirar. It's a brief coalition, organize a lot of institutions of civil society in Brazil, and try to block this process, which the automobile industry postpone these targets to achieve the Euro 6 standard. Next, please. And finally, an example about litigation and Families for Climate in the last year. Sorry, this year, I'm a little bit lost in the time because of the COVID. But this year, they ask for the São Paulo state for open the data to incentivize the automobile fossil industry, because have a lot of resources to incentivize this industry in São Paulo state, and the Families for Climate try to open this data and understand what exactly it did, because no one exactly knows what's happened. Next, please. And looking for the funding landscape, and this is important because we know that Brazil is not the focus when we talk about air quality, but it's a huge problem in Brazil. And as you saw, we don't have exactly the numbers because we don't have a very good network. But that's it, it's an important question in Brazil. And other insight, and it's important, the connection with health, public health. Definitely when we work with air quality, we link it directly with health. And the main question for us, we are a grantor institute, and this is important for us, the lack of specific financings for air quality in Brazil. We work with air quality in the transport portfolio, but we don't have a specifically funding for that, and that's it. We did a lot of work with small resources. So this is an important thing to say. Next, please. This is a picture for our team. This is before COVID. I like to show that when we can reunite in presence. Next, please. That's it. I hope it's useful. And here my contact, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Marcel. It's really interesting to hear about how Brazil has framed the air quality issue within its climate focus. I think that it's a big lessons learned in terms of how we tackle the air pollution problem in different cultural and political contexts, and understanding essentially like what is the most perceived or receptive in terms of different stakeholders engaging in the air quality problem. And it seems like in Brazil, thinking about transport and air quality and thinking about air quality monitoring within a particular industry, within the sector, is probably the most receptive at this stage. So it's really interesting to hear as a complementary perspective from other panelists. So thank you so much, really appreciate your presentation. So we have about 15 minutes for Q&A and a moderated panel discussion before entering closing remarks. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a moment so I can see you all. Great. So I want to take a moment to see if there's any questions from participants to any of the specific panelists, and if not, we also have moderated questions as well. I guess to get started, I'm wondering, so I think one of the major themes that came across from all four of your presentations is the lack of coordination and the fact that there's silos in terms of who is doing what in the air quality field. I'm wondering if you'd be able to articulate a little bit more in terms of what those gaps are and how your organization or how your philanthropic approach is trying to tackle this issue of coordination. Ankit, do you want to kick off? I know that you mentioned this a little bit in your presentation. Oh, I think you may be on if you can unmute.
Sorry, I couldn't hear your question very well. Did you talk about the difficulty?
Yeah, it's just a question of,
I'm sorry, the audio is not
how
clear.
your organization is tackling this issue of silos within the air quality field. I think Sensing Local, for example, is taking the research approach and wondering if you can articulate, for example, how you're going to use those research findings to improve coordination among different stakeholders in the air quality ecosystem.
Okay. I'll try to answer the question based on what we found in the survey so far that might be able to help on this. I also just wanted to mention, I may not have mentioned it earlier, this project is supported by the India Climate Collaborative and ETG Foundation. And I will not speak for them with regard to this, but I'll speak in terms of the project itself. One of the things that has come out as a possible solution is the idea of regional coordinators and national coordinators that are required to actually do active collaboration to promote active collaboration. Now, that's spoken about by many people, that there is a need for this coordinator that is a non-governmental agency or non-governmental platform that can do that. The second thing that has been talked about is that a lot of the coordination and siloed work is happening because people can't see each other, and the asymmetries with regard to that visibility. So is there a way in which we can create a shared portal of sorts where funding opportunities, reports, people's contacts, all of that get put in one place, a repository of sorts, which is where India Clean Air Connect may want to go as well. These two things have stood out a lot, I think, from the work we've seen so far. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much, Ankit. Sean, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult issue, and I think what we're at a stage of exploring, I think, and discovering what needs to be done. And I think organizations like my own are contributing a bit. I mean, just to give a bit of an example, we are convening the development agencies and the IFIs in a kind of working group to try to get them to talk to each other and to learn from each other as well. We found that they weren't sharing programming, they weren't aware of what each other was doing. And then obviously, of course, we can then feed that back into the conversations that we're having with philanthropy, and the work that we'll do to promote and socialize this year's State of Global Air Quality funding will contribute to that. But it's a multifaceted problem, and we'll take quite a few different approaches to fix.
Thank you, Sean. Priya?
Thanks, Sociedade. I think first of all, we really work very closely with partners such as the Clean Air Fund, the India Climate Collaborative, as well as others, the Shakti Sustainable Energy Foundation, which is another Indian-based philanthropic organization, to help us sort of convene and coordinate and understand partners, given the sort of number of geographies and areas that we work in. I think we really rely on some of the partners that we work closely with to help facilitate that sort of convening and exchange. And I'd like to share a few examples as well of some of the things that we've been more directly involved in. One of the things that we've initiated in India, working closely with the Indian government and Indian universities, is a national knowledge network on air pollution. And this is focused more on sort of technical institutes and governmental institutes. So it's still only kind of part of the puzzle. But even with those, it's sort of bringing together state pollution control boards with local academic and technical partners and facilitating exchange and knowledge sharing between them. And a couple of other examples also from India that Ankit mentioned, our partners, the Sustainable Energy Foundation, the India Climate Collaborative, and the Clean Air Fund have been putting together this air quality convening of various different stakeholders in the field that's taken place in person over the last few years, and I think is now planned as a virtual convening. And also there's another group, and I've heard some of the kind of references in the chat here from other countries, but I think there's also a lot of sort of self-organizing happening amongst sort of civil society groups. So both in kind of the UK and India, which are sort of examples that I'm more aware with, there are various kind of, exchange forums and WhatsApp groups and kind of collectives amongst civil society groups. So I think there's definitely room for kind of more coordination, but I think there's also some coordination that started happening, some of it through sort of self-mobilization. And then I think actual kind of convenings, whether in person or virtual, and mapping exercises like the kind that Ankit and Sensing Local and the Clean Air Fund have been doing are all very useful in contributing towards that.
Thank you so much, Priya. Marcel?
Well, we try to create these bridges in Brazil and to connect the different sectors of civil society, especially because we are a grant institute in climate. So we have a lot of initiatives in different areas, and air quality is a transversal subject. So we try to connect the different stakeholders in the industry, in the government, and with civil society. We are not in the best situations with our political scenarios, so we don't have a lot of adherence with the federal level, but we try to work the subnational levels about implementations, because in fact, the implementation is in the subnational levels, but we try to create these bridges and put the different sectors to dialogue, because sometimes different sectors have this difficulty to bring together and work in the same table for a specific target. So ICS try to put all these different stakeholders in the table and working together to leverage their quality questions and issues in Brazil.
Thank you, Marcel. I'm going to draw a question from the participants. I think it's a really important one. Why do you think that air pollution is so severely underfunded overall? Why have philanthropic organizations and governments not seen air pollution as a serious problem as it is? Is it a framing issue? Is it a coordination issue? I'm sure it's multi-level, but Sean, just given that you have the global overview, would love to hear your initial thoughts about this.
Okay, some initial thoughts. I think framing is really important. Somehow or other, we've not got the argument across that if you tackle air pollution, you deliver immediate benefits for public health, and at the same time, you accelerate action on climate. And what it seems to have happened is that the health people, are forefronting, more primary health issues, and the climate people are forefronting climate, and air quality is getting lost somewhere in between. And I just don't think we've made the case as sharply as we need to, and we need to do a better job at marshalling the evidence. I mean, there is really, really clear evidence now that the research is compelling and unequivocal on the huge economic costs and the huge health costs, and we need to deploy those arguments more vigorously.
Thank you, Sean. Priya?
I think there's a few different reasons. I definitely agree with Sean that we need to make kind of more compelling arguments on the multiple and co-benefits of tackling air quality, whether that's health, climate, quality of life, economic productivity. But I also think that there's been a challenge in kind of demonstrating some of the sort of successes or what may lead to kind of impacts in terms of funding going towards air quality. I think because there's not a sort of one single kind of easy solution because it's such a complex issue, it's also more challenging to sort of understand how that kind of funding can be most effectively channeled. So I think we also need to start communicating more the sort of strategies and success stories around how air quality can be improved. And I also think that there may be kind of limited funding going sort of specifically into air quality, but there's funding going into other things that also has air quality benefits. So for example, into transport or into energy. And I think we also need to sort of start connecting the dots in terms of how some of these actions or strategies that are not necessarily framed around air quality could be linked and leveraged to improve air quality. So I think there's a number of different dimensions to this.
Thanks so much, Priya. Marcel?
Yeah, if I agree with Priya, I think sometimes it's difficult to package the air quality issues because we have a lot of interfaces with energy, transportation, health, and it's difficult to package that and using as air quality and understand exactly the impacts, how we can exactly measure some initiatives and the impact in air quality. In Brazil, especially, I think the lack of the network is difficult. We don't have a lot of initiatives with low cost sensors. Maybe it's important to spread more sensors to understand exactly which is the problem, because I think sometimes the governments don't understand exactly the extension of the impacts of their pollution. So, and create more bases, more data, and expose that is a public health question. It's important. I think the lack of knowledge about that may be and probably impacting the public policies and initiatives to deal with that.
Thanks so much, Marcel. Ankit?
I was just thinking about this as you all were talking, and there are a couple of points that came to me, and I'm gonna merge both our experience at Sensing Local, where we do urban planning, and the survey. And so these are a couple of things that came to my mind. One is when we were mapping the growth of air quality organizations amongst the 87 interviews we had, we saw a huge pie of people that have come about since 2015, the Lancet report and others creating this public dialogue around it. And so if you look at communication itself, a lot of people have said it's AQI-based communication on air pollution is meaningless. So there is one aspect of this where people just don't seem to think that this is a problem because of the way the community had, that nobody's understanding what is 500 PM2.5 and how does it differ from 350 PM2.5. This is one thing. The second thing is that people have often talked about that the pie of philanthropic funding is still quite small. And in India, a country where we are still fighting for basics like health, education, water, it often takes second degree sort of priority. And so primary healthcare, which would then have to be redirected to air. So one of the big things has been talked about that we desperately need to increase the pie, and I think then it will benefit. There are two other points that I want to make. One is the third point is also the perception of air pollution being anti-development of sorts. Like tackling air pollution means not allowing the country to grow. And there is this thing that we are an emergent country. So yes, things are going to get ugly, things are going to get dirty, and we need to kind of deal with it. So there is that perception that I think need to be beaten as well. I think I had another point to say. Yeah, the last point I just want to talk about is also that if you're looking at inequality, the people who are supposed to be fighting for the rights, fighting for these things, are not feeling the burden of this as much as somebody else on the street who's a street hawker or somebody who's going on the road breathing polluted air every day. And so this inequality of exposure, the inequality of health impact of daily experience of air pollution is a huge driver of why. So when we talk about public demand, it's not just about awareness, it's actual the people who issue, both in terms of the health impact as well as from a knowledge perspective. So I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Ankit, and thank you all so much. We are at time, and I just wanted to ask for your permission if I can ask one last question to close, but I also just want, if you can give me a nod, if you're able to stay on the line for just a few more minutes. Okay, thanks for your permission. So I guess to close, would love to hear your thoughts on this question of what do you see as, or I guess it's a two-part question. What do you see as the trend moving forward in air quality philanthropy? And how do we actually build a stronger, more equitable air quality funding ecosystem? Let's start with Marcel.
The difficult one. And I think work these transversal approach, it's important. We need to connect better the industry, transportation, land use, everything with air quality and the impacts with health. And definitely the climate change is other important approach to deal with that. And if we can do that, we have a strong civil society and a strong network to work better in air quality. I think air quality is not a new problem, but maybe now we understand better and we deliver better the questions and use the network and use the experience in other areas, but definitely the other areas which have contact with air quality. It's an important way to create these paths and deal better with the issues in air quality and understand the different countries and the different approaches, because that's it. We understand in the US, Europe, India, China, and Brazil, it's totally different scenarios, but in all these countries, it's important to deal with air quality and how we can deal with different approaches and different solutions in so different contexts.
Thank you so much, Marcel. Priya?
In terms of the kind of trends that I see in sort of air quality funding that are emerging, I think there's definitely a growing emphasis on equity and inclusion and sort of engaging more with communities, and also sort of trying to approach air quality more strongly from a social and health perspective, along with an environmental and climate perspective. I think also there's sort of rising interest in Africa. I'm excited that Sean and colleagues at the Clean Air Fund are sort of starting to work on an Africa strategy. I know a lot of the multilaterals and bilaterals that I've been speaking to are looking at Africa more closely in light of the next COP taking place there. And I think there's been some sort of murmurs around rising interest in Africa, which I think would be very encouraging as well. In terms of your question on how do we sort of build a more diverse ecosystem, I think it's a lot of the things that we've sort of discussed today around sort of highlighting the impacts, emphasizing the benefits and the co-benefits, demonstrating examples and communicating examples of success and connecting different actors together. I think we need to kind of keep doing more of that, and that will hopefully have a sort of multiplier effect as well.
Thank you, Priya. Ankit?
So I can speak more from what would be an aspirational position, since we are not funders ourselves. What seems to be occurring is that while a lot of the philanthropic funding in the previous years has gone into like setting up monitoring works and doing the harder hardware stuff of it, I think there is a lot of need emerging to fund the softer stuff, which is capacity building, getting people together, ecosystem building, because this is something that's been hugely missed out. And that is the way to become diverse. That is the way moving towards going from bigger grants to smaller grants. In the sense, going away from
We may have lost you, Ankit. Sean, I'm wondering, would you be able to share some of your thoughts while we wait for Ankit to come back online?
Yeah, I mean, it's my experience of webinars that the interesting questions always come at the end, and the hardest questions always come at the end. And I'm looking in the chat, and I'm looking in the Q&A, and there are some really sort of challenging and interesting questions there, which I know we're not going to have a time to get into unfortunately. But in terms of trends, I think my colleagues on the panel have made some interesting observations. I think in terms of our tracking of the data, we are seeing a slight uptick in funding from a low base in the philanthropy side, and one of our hopes, one of our targets is to try to drive more funding from the development agency and the IFIs into this space. So, and that goes back to the question we answered earlier on about what's going to motivate that to happen, which we need to continue to work on and think about. And I think to the point that Priya made, and I think Marcel as well, around, and I think this was maybe a subtext to what I said earlier on about the types of funders coming into air quality beginning to perhaps shift. We might see an increased awareness of the differing social impacts of population for different population groups, for pollution for different population groups. And I think that's particularly the case in the US, where the environmental justice movement has been alive and around for a long time, but it is more empowered over the last year. And we will see, I think we're seeing more of that kind of conversation taking place. I certainly see it in the UK now, but as Ankit said, sometimes those less empowered voices of the people who are most affected by pollution are the ones that really struggle to cut through and be heard. So we have a job to do to try and help them raise their voice.
Thank you so much, Sean. And yeah, I very much echo your sentiment about all these great questions. I'm wondering if we collate them, the panelists would be open to sharing any responses via email. I'm sure that participants would appreciate that, as they're all active participants in the air quality ecosystem as well. I'm just going to share my screen one last time to share the last slide. But really appreciate our panelists. Thank you so much, Marcel, Sean, Priya, Ankit, for your wonderful presentations and really for sharing your diverse perspectives on this important issue. And we'd like to thank our funders, Bloomberg Philanthropies, Clean Air Fund, and Climate Works Foundation for making this webinar possible. Wanted to remind those that want to stay in touch with us, please go to openaq.org, an opportunity to also support by donating to the organization as well. And thank you all to the participants and our OpenAQ community for being such wonderful supporters of OpenAQ and for doing such incredible work on the ground. So thank you all so much for tuning in today, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Stay healthy and stay well. Thank you.